questions made me think there. The first, why do you think there's more innovation in the American cannabis market, which is also highly regulated? We also have advertising and brand content, restraints or constraints.
From my standpoint, if you're investing in innovation or like going through like proper R&D cycles, it takes time, and you very much have to approach it from like a long-term success standpoint. Whereas I personally think that the detriment of a lot of the Canadian companies is that they're just completely optimizing for the next 90 days. And in doing so, you kind of become blindsided to how are you actually going to be here in a decade from now? Like what is your strategy to succeed in the long term? Whereas I get the sense there's a lot of American companies that are very much seeking to become the powerhouses of the global cannabis industry for the foreseeable future. Whereas I don't know, was that same statement true in Canada? I think they had the ambition. I just don't think that they had the sort of operational experience to take that ambition and actually turn it into the companies that can produce these types of results. So I think it really just speaks to the fact that there are companies willing to take longer term bets in the States, whereas courtesy of a lot of these Canadian companies going public far too early, they just don't have that sort of creative bandwidth to actually pursue these sort of paths of producing innovative products courtesy of going through proper R&D cycles.
Interesting. I mean, it takes a long time to build a brand, right? It is not a 90-day cycle in any stretch of the imagination. So can you speak to exporting? So I know, are there companies in Canada, Canadian companies that are successfully exporting? What does that market look like? Obviously, we can't export yet. I know a lot of people are waiting for that day, but and even, in the States, I mean, in the country, is there a lot of movement, across provinces and exporting outside of Canada? How does that all work?
There certainly is a lot of movement of goods internally in Canada. I don't have any stats on hand as to what's happening from an export market standpoint. However, one thing I would say, and this is kind of like a particular point of view I have, which is that long term, I don't see that as a viable solution in any context. The reality is that the cost of producing cannabis in Canada is vastly more expensive versus producing cannabis in a country like South America, whereby they have the ideal climate to cultivate cannabis outdoors. And ultimately, the cost of labor down there is significantly cheaper versus that of what it would cost to hire a Canadian individual. So my overarching thesis is that anyone who's currently gaining revenues courtesy of exporting products, it's very much going to be a short-term play. I don't see it playing out in the long term. They're very much dependent upon regulations being unfavorable to companies in those local economies. But at the point in which the local governments arrive at the realization that, hold on a second here, we're basically hiring or we're employing people abroad as opposed to creating employment locally, courtesy of not allowing companies that are in our area produce these products, I think inevitably they're going to arrive at the realization, why don't we just create this employment for ourselves? Why are we hiring Canadian people when we can hire people in Argentina or any other sort of country for that matter? So I do think that's going to pose a lot of problems long term. However, in the short term, there's definitely companies who are getting generous revenue streams courtesy of this sort of difficult global cannabis landscape whereby a lot of nations are yet to allow people to cultivate cannabis.
Are there any Canadian brands that you think that will survive that? That yes, it's expensive, it's a Canadian brand, but it's going to have a cachet, or it will survive that challenge, I guess.
There's a number of them for sure. Like Tantalus is definitely one of the top sort of contenders. G-Tech, who are sort of a house of brands, like a P&G of sorts, whereby they sort of produce like a number of, or a family of brands rather. I think they stand a great chance, and they're one of very limited number of companies who have sort of pushed the envelope in terms of like what's acceptable from an innovation standpoint. It could be as simple as like listing the terpenes on a product. Very, very simple sort of, I wouldn't even call it a product feature as much as I'd say like it's almost like borderline like marketing of the product. Nonetheless, a lot of consumers were asking if this information could become available, and it just so happened to be that they were the first. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because they do seem to have like a very good pulse as to what consumers are actually wanting, and that's providing them with those products. I do think they'll survive. I do think G-Tech will survive. I subscribe to the viewpoint that there'll likely be like one or two of the larger producers will stay around. Canopy is just so flush with cash that it's very hard to see a world in which Canopy does not exist. However, do they exist as like the powerhouse of the Canadian cannabis industry? I don't think so. I think that there's going to be a reckoning in the future for Canopy, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay, I see Brandon's popped in, but I have one question to follow up. I could keep talking for a long time. This is interesting. Thank you. But packaging and labeling, so we get a lot of conversations. We're a compliance operation platform. We work with a lot of advisors, and packaging and labeling is a big deal here. And part of building a brand is that, well, you mentioned the terpenes on the package. Is branding, what does that look like in Canadian packaging? Is it sophisticated, sort of consumer facing packaging, or is it really, what does that look like? Just interesting.
I would say that the packaging producers choose is probably the most underrated component of how to actually like really resonate with a consumer outside of the product itself, sort of delighting the consumer. The reason why I say that is that there have been a very small number of companies who have sort of bended the rules as opposed to broken the rules, and I think that's a very important point. Like, it's very easy to break the rules, and I think we all know what it looks like when you do so. However, a few companies, like Flower Co. being one of them, whereby they decided to adopt like a really interesting color format whereby as soon as you see their product, you know it is exactly that company. Whereas if I was to show you any company from Tilray or Hexo or Canopy Growth, I think you'd have a very difficult time identifying who actually produced that brand. Whereas There's been a very few companies that have, really taken a bold step. And as I said, they're bending the rules, that they're probably not the favorite child in the eyes of Canadian regulators. However, that doesn't really matter. Like, the only thing that matters is consumers resonating with the products you're producing. And I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes.
Do you think that the larger companies you were talking about haven't been more proactive with packaging and labeling because of the regulations, or because they don't need to, or they just, packaging and labeling seems to me such a key point to get people's attention. And, it's very interesting to me that the larger companies aren't making the most of bending the rules to work for them, since a lot of big companies do that all the time, right?
I think it might be a case of like they perceive they've the most to lose, and I guess to a certain extent they do, because like they have the most market share. Whereas if you're the incumbent, the onus is on you to do something differently. Whereas if you're the market leader as per current standards, you probably feel like you might have more to lose than you have to gain by sort of falling unfavorably in the eyes of regulators. That's sort of my 2 cents. Is that I think the advantage they have is that they don't really mind if they get a slap on the wrist from the regulators. They'll take it in their tracks. Whereas if you're Canopy, you might be a lot more mindful of the fact, the public markets might slaughter you if something was to come out whereby it was perceived that, Canopy broke the rules. Because we have an incident in Canada whereby, I'm trying to think of the company here, Canada Trust, I believe is the name of the organization, and they broke the rules, and ultimately that led to the bankruptcy of that company. So I do think that there's probably like a little bit of PTSD from that particular instance. However, for the most part, these companies definitely should be trying to bend the rules to the best of their ability.
I have one more question, and then we'll kick it to Brandon. Compliance in general. Obviously, we're a compliance platform operation. That's definitely our wheelhouse. I'm interested. So it sounds like cannabis is highly regulated in Canada. Would you say it's are the enforcement officers out there looking? Is it enforced? I guess there's lots of regulation. What's the difference in the compliance landscape, I guess, between the two countries?
There's a lot of really sort of draconian policies in place. However, I haven't seen that much enforcement of them, candidly. And I personally think if I was in the sort of the operating seat, or I was the executive of one of these companies, like I would bend the rules at any given opportunity, just because if they're not enforcing them, why not take advantage of the situation? Now, again, the very clear distinction between like outright breaking the rules and just bending the rules to your advantage. However, there definitely has been a sort of greater clampdown on like unlicensed grows. Like previously, like a lot of people would get far more. They would basically get a designation to produce far more cannabis than they needed for medical purposes, and then a lot of that product was finding its way to the illicit market. Now, I honestly would say the decline of that strategy is probably a lot more associated with the fact that the prices of cannabis in Canada in the legal market are collapsing, such that it's just not as profitable as it was to produce cannabis for the illicit market. So the enforcement is almost the market itself, as opposed to people actually having to go out and enforce these policies as individuals per se.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you. This has been great.